There's a book that was written in 1737 called The Crook and the Lot. How many of you have heard of this book? If you haven't read it or you haven't heard about it, you probably don't know what that title means. So a crook is not like we tend to think about it at Heritage, where last Christmas we were deprived of everything that we own because there was a crook in the lot. Or I used to own, Gathering Place had a food truck and we parked it in the parking lot here, and last year it was stolen as well because a couple crooks came into our lot. But that's not what Thomas Boston was talking about. Back then, a crook meant something that's made crooked, something that's uncomfortable, something that's undesirable, something you don't want. We might call it today adversity. That is a crook. And what is a lot? We sing it sometimes, don't we? Whatever my lot, you have taught me to say, it is well with my soul. Or as the famous Irish folk song goes, since it fell into my lot that I should rise and you should not. We use it in our day-to-day, but do we know what it means? And so your lot is the cards that you've been dealt. It's the hand that you've been dealt in this life. So you didn't pick, nobody in here picked when they would be born. None of you picked where you would be born. You didn't pick who your parents were. You didn't pick what you would look like. You didn't pick what your natural abilities were or your features. And in the same way, when you were born again, you didn't pick what your spiritual gifts were or your spiritual affinities. And that's part of the adventure of being a Christian. You get a whole new set of gifts and and you get to go out and figure out who you are. You don't even know. That's part of your lot. And included in this as well is even God's providence, how God chooses to move in your life or how he chooses not to move in your life. And all of those things together, the providence, the features, your own attributes, all that comes into your lot. And bringing it all together, what does it mean then to have a crook in your lot? It's adversity. There are things in your life that you don't want to be there, and yet they are there. You wouldn't have put them there, and yet here they are glaring at you. And in this book, if you want to read it, Thomas Boston goes through and he categorizes, like all good theologians do. He says these are all the ways that God can put adversity in your life. And he says there's 4 things. There's afflictions that are common to mankind. You can get sick. He can attack your reputation and your honor. He can attack, and maybe that's not the right word, he can put these things in your path, in this adversity, your vocation and your relationships. All of these things God can make crooked, and it's all a play on Ecclesiastes 7:13, which says, what God has made crooked, what man can make it straight? And he goes on to say, you will have prosperity, some will have prosperity, and at the same time somebody else will have adversity, but it is God who gives both. And so I say all that just to introduce the Apostle Paul, who in our section in Acts 22, if you want to turn there, we're continuing our journey through Acts, and we're almost done. His way has been made crooked in about every way that God could make it crooked. His physical health is gone. His reputation is gone. His vocation is gone. His relationships, it's all been destroyed. And these are the same ways that Paul has been tempted. These are the same categories that you will face adversity to. And so we want to pay attention to how Paul handles the adversity that he comes across. Because beginning in Acts 20, Paul says he's going to Jerusalem knowing all that's going to happen to him there. And so then that was in Acts 20, and now here we are in Acts 22, and we get to see what he had in mind. He's like, all these terrible things are going to happen, and now we get to see, oh, this is what he meant. So between Acts 21 and Acts 26, we get to see what is called the trials of Paul. And it's not trials like temptations and testing. It's trials like he's standing before the emperor, he's standing before the governor, he's standing before the Sanhedrin or the tribunes, and he's having to give a defense of himself to all of these different people. And depending on how you count, he has to go through 6 different trials in these few chapters. And I say it depends on how you count because today we're in Acts 22, verse 17, and he's in the middle of giving a defense of himself, not to some official authority, but he's having to give a defense of himself to his own family, essentially. The people he calls brothers. He's having to give a defense of himself to his kinsmen in the temple, right? This is his place. And so he finds himself defending himself. It's the word apologia. It's where we get apologetics. He's having to do apologetics on himself. And so just to catch you up, if you weren't here, if you haven't been here, Paul is coming into Jerusalem. He's been preaching to the Gentiles. He's been preaching a message that they don't really appreciate. And so when he comes into town, they begin to, they kind of whip up a mob and a riot. And they start to beat him in the middle of the temple. And so it's the job during feast time. Actually, Rome always had an eye on Jerusalem. They always kept some people stationed there, but there's a fort just outside the temple that overlooked the temple, and it was the job of the Roman police to make sure that no riots happen. Well, Paul comes in, and a riot happens, and so here come the Roman police, and they come down, and they save his life, and they arrest him. And they take him back up into the barracks that are there in the temple. But here's what Paul does. Have you guys heard the expression, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail? What about if you're a preacher? Everything kind of looks like a pulpit. And this is the excitement and the joy of Paul. He starts to walk up those steps to Antonia, which is a fort, and he's going to prison. And as he's ascending these steps, he says, you know what, this is kind of a raised platform. This kind of looks like a pulpit. And that angry mob down there, they kind of look like a congregation. He says, I think this might be a good opportunity for me to give a lesson. And so as he's standing up, as he's walking up the steps, he looks to the Romans that have arrested him. He says, do you mind if I address these people? And what do they say? Sure. And so we want to admire him in the sense because he's been beaten, right? He's been beaten within an inch of his life. He's been arrested. And where anybody else might say, no, it's time to rest. No, like obviously my message isn't working here. He says, do you mind if I share something? And he takes the crook that is in his lot, and you could say Acts 21-26 is either one massive piece of adversity or it's 1,000 little things that all add up to just what should be a horrible experience for Paul. But he says, no, I want to leverage this as an opportunity to share. And he doesn't teach them. He doesn't preach a sermon to them. What does he do? He shares his testimony, which is what John taught on last week. And he rightly said that your story or your testimony, your lot, is a gift. It's a gift that you've been given, and we don't want to discount this. Sometimes we think about testimonies as being some kind of lesser thing. Well, if there's no preacher and you don't have anything else to do, I guess somebody could share. But this is Paul's go-to, and he essentially says, you guys know me. He calls them brothers and fathers. These are his people. And as you're going to see, these are the people that he used to persecute Christians with. He murdered Stephen with these people. Like, they know Paul. And so he says, what I want you to do, I don't want to give you a lecture on regeneration. What I want to do is I want to fill you in on everything that God has been doing in my life since I last talked to you. And so he walks up the pulpit, he turns around and he addresses the congregation, and he begins sharing his testimony. And that's where we are today. And so we're going to look at kind of these three movements in the text today. So we're going to start in verse 17, and we're going to call it God's conversation with Paul. And we're going to finish up his testimony. And the way we phrase this is really important because Paul doesn't have a conversation with God. God comes to him in a vision and overtakes him, literally rips him out of consciousness and has a conversation with him. So Paul doesn't want to have any of these conversations. He doesn't put this is his lot. It has been given to him. So we'll say God talks to Paul. And then we come and the Jews talk to Paul. And it's a very short conversation that they have. And then we move over and the Romans are going to talk to Paul. And we're going to squeeze out of kind of these three conversations everything that the Holy Spirit has inspired in here. So in Acts 22, beginning in verse 17, let's listen to Paul finish his testimony, or as far as they'll let him get. It says in verse 17, it happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I fell into a trance. And I saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another, I used to imprison and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I also was standing by and approving and watching out for the coats of those who were slaying him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. God talking to Paul. It says it's part of his testimony. he looks up and well, he doesn't look up. It says he fell into a trance. And the word trance is the word in the original, it's ecstasy, which is where we get our word ecstasy. And what ecstasy meant in this time was, it can mean two things. There's kind of a popular definition, and then it kind of has this nuanced definition. And the popular definition meant to be beside yourself emotionally. You are so excited, you are so amazed, you are so in awe that you are just beside yourself emotionally. And then there's this more rare usage of it where it literally means to be beside yourself physically. And so how do you define this? Well, the best we can do, the technical definition is you are in a state of being which you are either wholly or partially removed from consciousness. And it's kind of an act that's associated with the divine author. So it's an activity associated with God, and you're either wholly or partially removed from consciousness. And so we don't know which it is. Is he in consciousness? Is he out of consciousness? The only other time this happens in the Bible, the only other trance, the only other ecstasy was Peter in Acts 10. It says twice that when he was in Joppa on the roof of Simon the Tanner, right, he looks up and he sees this sheet coming down. He's in a vision, and there's all these animals on it. And Jesus says, take, kill, eat. That's whatever that was, is what happened to Paul here. Whatever that was, he says he fell into a trance, and he was having a conversation with God. And God says in verse 18, he's saying to Paul, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. There's kind of like a testimony inception here, because he's talking with God about giving his testimony to the Jews, as he's talking to the Jews, giving his testimony that God says they're going to reject. And you see, like, there's this, he's talking about the Jews, he's talking to God about the Jews while he's talking to the Jews. You see what I'm saying? So he's giving his testimony, and God says, make haste, get out of Jerusalem, because they're not going to accept this testimony. And what does it mean to make haste? To do something quickly. Well, he says it, make haste and get out of Jerusalem. And then he says again, quickly. So are you getting the picture? You're supposed to leave right now. Make haste, go quickly, get out of here. And he doesn't even say get out of here. He says in verse 21, go, for I will send you not to the next town, not a little bit away. I'm going to send you far away to the Gentiles. And what does Paul do in response to God telling him to get out and to get out now? He starts to reason with him. And he brings in his logic. You've never done this, have you? You've never known better. And he says, Lord, verse 19, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another, I used to imprison and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I also was standing by approving and watching out for the coats of those who were slaying him. So he says, no, God, you got it all wrong. Look, these are my people. We might say, I went to high school with these people. Like, they knew all the stuff I used to do. They were there when we put the principal's car on the roof. They know these are my people. They were there when we went from one synagogue after another, when we were persecuting Christians. And he even goes to the worst thing that he did. He said, even that act where the first Christian martyr in the church happened, when we murdered Stephen, I watched everyone's coats and I gave the seal of approval to the murder of the first Christian martyr. He said, they're going to listen to me when I give my testimony. And God's response is, it's almost like he doesn't even listen to him. He says, go, I'm going to send you far away to the Gentiles. And so essentially what he's saying is, you're trying to be rational about this. You're trying to approach this from a point of logic, but their rejection of my testimony and their rejection of me is not a logical rejection. You don't not believe in God because all the facts aren't there, or the logic isn't there, or because the person's ethos and social equity isn't there, or it's a moral and spiritual issue. And Ephesians 4 talks about this as well. He says, you walk no longer as the Gentiles do. He's talking to the Jews, but the same principle applies. He says, in the futility of their mind, being darkened in their understanding, excluded from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the hardness of their heart. They're not going to accept the testimony. It's not because Paul wasn't a good friend of theirs. They're not accepting the testimony because their heart is hard, and they've rejected Christ. They've stumbled over the stumbling stone. That's what it is. If it's not logical, at least it's not purely logical. And it makes another interesting point that God knows best where you're going to be fruitful, doesn't he? Paul says, no, I'm going to bear fruit among the Gentiles. He has every reason to believe. He's like, these are my people. They know me. I have the shared experiences with them. I've built social equity with them. They know what kind of character of person I was. All the signs seem to indicate that I'm going to be extremely fruitful among the Jews, among my people. And God says, no, that's not where you're going to be fruitful. You're not the minister to the Jews. You are the minister to the Gentiles. You need to go far away because that's where you're going to bear fruit. And so the same is true for you, and the same is true for me. We go and we bloom wherever God plants us. And sometimes it's helpful to think of the Christian life as a current where God's will is kind of pulling us along, and it's not our job to kind of cling and try and hold on and fight it. This is part of the adventure of being a Christian. You don't know where you're going to bear fruit. You have to just let go of control of your own life, bow the knee to the lordship of Jesus, and just go where he tells you to go because he knows where you're going to bear fruit. He knows where you're going to be the most effective. And so he tells Paul, you're going to be effective far away from here, and you're going to be effective right now, like it's time to go. And so he says, go, I will send you far away, verse 21, to the Gentiles. And so with that word, we transition from God's conversation with Paul to a very short conversation that the Jews have with Paul. Because the Jews, at that word Gentiles, lose their minds. They lose it. Because here you have God saying, salvation isn't uniquely for the Jews. It's not Paul that's saying it. It's not his opinion anymore. He's giving his testimony where God told him, salvation isn't just for you. The same salvation that you have, first off, you've rejected it. And second off, I'm taking it to the most hated people, the Gentiles. And salvation, he's saying, is for everybody. It's for the Jew, it's for the Greek, it's for the poor, it's for the rich, it's for the born, it's for the unborn. The gospel of Jesus Christ is for everybody. And at that word, it says in verse 22, they listened to him up until that statement, or up until that word, ethne, where we get the word ethnic, everybody else. Then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. So they were already trying to kill him before. They knew his message before, and now you see they pause and they actually listen to him for a minute, don't they? I think if it was any other criminal, they might not have given him a listen. But here's the point: it's Saul, it's Paul. He's leveraging this relationship that he has to make an opportunity where one might not have existed apart from it. He's leveraging that social equity. He's leveraging his relationship with them, and they listen until that one word. They raise their voices and they say, away from such a fellow. And so when they were trying to kill him before, it was because of blasphemy. When they try and kill him now, it's because of blasphemy. And what's the penalty if you go back and read Leviticus 24 for blasphemy? You die. And it's a very specific death. You get stoned with stones. And so here the Jews want to take him outside the city and start throwing rocks at him, but unfortunately the Romans have him. And so all they can do is just start tearing their clothes and pulling out their beards and shaking out the dust of their garments, which just symbolizes you're a Gentile to us. You're no longer, this is the breakdown in relationships. And it says that they begin picking up dust and throwing it at him. Why do they do that? That's just because there's no rocks in the temple. They don't have anything to kill him with. They can't go grab him and take him outside the city, so all they can do is just yell at him and throw a bunch of dirt at him, and that's what they do, but Paul gets the picture. Your word is not wanted here. And it gives us a little bit of assurance, too, because when we leverage all of these things that Paul leverages, the equity, the relationships, the ethos, that he's a wonderful character, he leverages those things, but that doesn't mean that people are going to accept what you have to say. They might accept you, but they're not going to accept your message. They might accept you, but that doesn't mean they're going to accept your testimony about God, as we see with Paul. And he leverages everything. He's going to even leverage in a minute his own citizenship. Let's finish reading this. Verse 22, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. 23, and as they were crying out and throwing off their cloaks and tossing dust into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by scourging, so that they might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. The Romans have no idea what's happening here. They don't speak the language of the Jews. So Paul asks in Greek, can I talk to these people? And they say yes, and then he turns around and all they can do is gauge the audience response. And so their job is just to keep a riot from happening. And so he turns around and everybody's like, looks kind of like you do now. Okay, they're listening. They're accepting me for now. And then all of a sudden there's a frenzy and they're like, okay, no, now let's figure out what's going on here because something isn't right. And so here you see in Acts 20, Paul says he set his face to Jerusalem knowing all that would happen here. And now we see what that is, isn't it? Beaten, arrested, brought up because makes an opportunity out of it to address the people, and then he's rejected by his own people. And so Paul counted the cost that was ahead of him, and we get to see now what he was talking about. Now, we sang a new song a minute ago called Face Like Flint. Do you guys remember that one? When we sang that, did you sing it as worship, or did you just sing the words? Did you sing it, like Lou said, as part of your testimony, as part of this wrestling that you have in your own Christian experience? Or did you write it off because it was in a style that wasn't to your liking, or because it was kind of repetitive? Because I think this song is Acts 22. This defines Paul, and it defines us as we go through crooks in our lot and adversity. And so let me show you maybe what you missed in that song. It was written actually by a local pastor. That was Josh Kotz. It was the title song on his last album, and I love it because it starts the song as kind of wrestling. It's you talking to your own soul. It's you talking to yourself, and you're saying, is the Lord worth it? Is he worthy of me holding nothing back in my service to him? And you say, I could wait. And we start off well. He says, I could wait, but I don't want to. I want to give you all of the glory. But then you tell yourself this refrain, okay, glory, glory, you are worthy. Glory, glory, you are worthy. But wait, God, I could wait for a better season. There might be a better time for me. I've got a lot of really good things going on right now. And God, if I let go and just let the current of God pull my life, if I let him be in control of my life, he might screw up the things that I have going here. And so we say, I could wait for better seasons. But then you tell yourself, no, your merit is all I need. This is not for me. This is for you, to give you glory. You're worthy in spite of me. And so at that moment, you repeat to yourself this refrain. You say, glory, glory, you are worthy. Glory, glory, you are worthy. And there comes a point, and I pray to God that you've been here. There comes a point in your life where you resolve and you say, yes, he is worthy. I'm going to follow Christ, whatever the cost. And you tell yourself, he is worth it, so I set my face like flint to follow Christ. Damn the consequence. And from that moment, the whole tenor of the song changes. And from that moment in your life, the whole tenor of your life changes. And there's a joy. And you're no longer singing the refrain, wrestling with yourself. Should I give myself wholly to God? Now you say, Lord, I've done it. And there's a joy in it. And you say, glory, glory, you are worth it. And you're looking back and you're recognizing that you are no longer in control of your own life. Jesus is. And what a wonderful place to be under his guidance and his good pleasure and his providence. We set our face like flint. And this is what Jesus did. All the way back in Luke 9, Jesus says he set his face like flint, fulfilling all the prophecies in Isaiah about him. He set his face like flint to do the will of the Lord, knowing what would happen to him in Jerusalem. And it was Jesus, it was his lot to end his life in Jerusalem. Paul, walking in just as Jesus did in Acts 20, says he set his face to go to Jerusalem, knowing everything that would happen there. And so now, again, we get to see what would happen there. But it wasn't Paul's lot to die in Jerusalem like his Lord's. He had other things to do, but he still has set his face like flint to go whatever it is that the Lord has for him. And so it is for us to do the same thing. We set our face like flint to lean into the lot that God has given us, to lean into the gifts that he's given us and the power that he's given us, and to just bow our knee fully to his lordship and to his guidance and his direction. Paul says, be imitators of me, 1 Corinthians 13, as I am of Christ. Well, Christ set his face to obey the will of the Lord. Paul set his face, and so we too must set our face to follow the Lord. And so with this uproar, we move into the third movement of the text. This is the Romans conversation with Paul. It's a little bit longer. And you see that this, you guys know what cancel culture is? This is like the cancel culture before it was cool. This is, the Jews don't like Paul. He's a local celebrity. And so what do you do if you don't like what somebody has to say? You just silence them. And so that's what happens. The Romans come and pull him, and they take him into the barracks, and they have actually a really humorous conversation with him. Let's read beginning in verse 22. No, we've read 22. Let's read beginning in verse 24. The commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating he should be examined by scourging, so they might find out the reason why they were shouting against him in that way. But when they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who was a Roman and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and told him, saying, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman." And the commander came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And he says, "Yes." And the commander answered him, "I acquired this citizenship with a large sum of money." And Paul says, "But I was actually born a citizen." Therefore, those who were about to examine him immediately let go of him. And the commander also was afraid when he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had put him in chains. And so Cicero gives us good insight into this. He has a quote that says, to bind a Roman citizen is against the law. It's illegal. It's unlawful. To bind a Roman citizen in itself is breaking the law. To scourge one is an abomination. But to put him to death, to slay him, is almost an act of murder. Almost. And so they find out Paul is a citizen. And he's not just a citizen, he's a citizen by birth, which is even more onerous in that time. And so they find out, right, and they know what their role is. And so they say, they unbind him. Immediately they take him out because they already know they've broken the law. And not only that, they've stretched him out on the racks, and they're about to give him the flagellum, which was what they gave to Jesus before he was crucified. The cat of nine tails, you guys know about that, the whip with the bits of knuckle bone and metal in it, which just the whole purpose is to rip the flesh off your back. And they would do this often just to make people submissive before they talk to him. And so for Paul, they can't wait to get the flagellum out because they have no idea what's happening. The commander of this time, they're called a tribune. It calls him the tribune, maybe in your translation. That's just the guy that's in charge of all the troops that are stationed in Fort Antonia. He's in charge of the troops, and his name, we'll learn in Acts 23, is Claudius Lysias. And Claudius Lysias comes up to Paul when he comes in, when he first meets him, and he says, "Aren't you the Egyptian assassin?" And Paul says, "I've been all things to all people, but no, I'm not an Egyptian assassin." And so he's already confused. And then he says, "Can I talk to these people? I'm a Jew. I'm from here. These are my people." So he's like, okay, he's a Greek-speaking Jew from Jerusalem. Got it. And he addresses the people, and then they bring him in to examine him. And he says, "You can't whip me because I'm a Roman citizen." And so now he's an Aramaic or Hebrew-speaking Roman from Tarsus. And so Claudius is like, "Get out the whip and whip this guy, and let's figure out who he is, and let's move on from this scenario and keep the peace." And so really they have no idea. And on top of all of it, they don't speak the language. So everything that he's been saying for the last however long, his entire testimony, they don't have a clue. It could be his grocery list for all they know. And so they're saying, "Get out the whip, let's figure out what this guy is doing." When they stretched him out, Paul says, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" The centurion, the man over 100, heard this, and he goes to the commander, that's Claudius Lysias, and he says, "What are we about to do? For this man is a Roman." And so you see, Paul has leveraged many things, as you should, in his making these opportunities where none exist, right? He's leveraged his social equity, and you should do the same. We don't want to peddle Christ like we peddle Avon, but as the Spirit brings opportunity and gives you witness to speak out, you should make the opportunity. Leverage your relationships. Leverage the equity that you've built. Leverage the character that you have in front of people. And when they say, why are you such a good person? Why do you always do the right thing? That's your opportunity. Now is your chance to consider giving your testimony. But here, Paul's lot is not to end in Jerusalem. He's got to take the gospel to the Gentiles. He's got to go preach the gospel in Rome. That's his lot. And so he leverages his own citizenship to spare his own back so that he can go forward and finish what God has in store for him. But I want to point out, Jesus' lot was to end in Jerusalem. And so whereas Jesus Christ, when his back was exposed and he was stretched out on the racks to the flagellum, he didn't appeal to the citizenship that he could have appealed to, did he? Because Paul appeals, he says, I'm a citizen of Rome, and what is more glorious than to be a Roman citizen by birth? That is the highest authority in the land that you could appeal to. And so he says, I am a Roman citizen. Well, Jesus Christ was a citizen too, but not of Rome. He was a citizen of heaven. And he could have appealed to that, and he could have spared his own back and his own life, but that wasn't his lot. That wasn't his mission. That wasn't his journey. He exposed himself to the flagellum. He gives up his own freedom. He suppresses the rights of his own citizenship so that you could be the prize for you. And so you now, being a believer, share the same citizenship that Jesus does. This is not your world. We are citizens of heaven, and Jesus is our King. And so leverage your rights when it's right to leverage your rights, and don't leverage them when you don't need to. But keep in mind, this text doesn't give us some kind of formula to comfort us when we go through adversity. And I know you all well enough to know you have tremendous adversity in your life, in your vocations, in your relationships, in your health, in your reputation. And these are a sermon in itself, 100 sermons on how to deal with these. But the text today doesn't tell us how to cope while we're in these situations, while we're in adversity. What it does say is when there's a crook in your lot, when you're facing adversity, you need to make the most out of every opportunity. Remembering your citizenship is not of this world. Your citizenship is of heaven. And Jesus Christ is your Lord. And so today, this morning, just as Paul did, just as Jesus did, set your face like flint to obey the will of God. Go on the adventure that he has set before you, not knowing where you will be heading, but trusting God to lead you along the way. Set your face to walk in the will of God, regardless what the consequences are. Would you all pray with me? Jesus, thank you for your example. Thank you for your salvation. Though you were a citizen of heaven, you gave up all the privileges of that citizenship so that you could have us, so that you could have me. And for that, we love you so much. We know if you would be willing to do that, God, then we can trust you with our lives. We know that you only have our good in mind. Even when we face adversity, Lord, you are working all things for our good and for your glory. Give us the strength to reach that portion in our life where we set our face, where we say, you are worthy. Therefore, we set our face like flint. As we repeat the refrain from here forevermore, and when adversity comes, we cry out, glory, glory, you, God, are worthy. We love you. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.